this is more history and background, but it's really vitally important stuff that most Americans have no idea about, that is literally happening right in front of us as we're speaking. And that this is the main way that democracies get taken down. This is how democracies are destroyed. And it's done by something that we don't really have a word for right now. I mean, we do have the word, but we haven't really used it in 150 years or so. Back during the founding generation in the 1700s, this was called faction. And a faction is a group that not only has its own interest. I mean, today we talk about special interest groups. Arguably they're factions. But the specific meaning of the word faction in the 18th century was a group whose interests are opposed, are different from, are in opposition to the interests of the vast majority of the public or the nation itself. Today, you might want to call them, traitors? Or at least traitors to democracy? It was a faction of oligarchs led by Vladimir Putin back in 99-2000 that took over Russia after Russia adopted Milton Friedman's neoliberal policies of privatization, low taxes, and deregulation, which led straight to his terrible decisions in Ukraine. So where does this start? It always starts, with a faction of wealthy people corrupting politics in country after country over centuries, literally over centuries. Faction always leads to this doom loop of democracy. Aristotle warned about it. Bernie Sanders warns about it. FDR called the faction of his day the economic royalists. Here's how the doom loop goes. Number one, just to understand, government, in order to protect itself and protect the people that it represents, representative government does two things that prevent the doom loop from happening, the doom loop of faction. The first is they regulate taxes on the very, very rich and corporations so that you don't have an aristocracy, an oligarchy emerge, so that you don't have an eruption of billionaires. Before Ronald Reagan, there wasn't a single billionaire in America. Now we've got, 700 of them? And they're getting very politically active, and they can wipe out pretty much anybody's efforts and, to do anything. So number one, governments keep taxes high to prevent, an aristocracy from emerging in a nation. And number two, they regulate money in politics so that the government itself can't be corrupted. So the second step in the doom loop is that the corporations and individuals who basically own and control the marketplace decide that they're going to throw off the shackles of government. So they get together and pour money into politics, enough to buy all the politicians and judges that they need. Then their wholly owned politicians and judges go out and weaken, lower taxes on themselves and weaken the laws that protect the democracy from the influence of big money. And then, of course, what happens is that as the country spirals down into aristocracy and oligarchy, the middle class gets wiped out, the rich get massively richer, and they recycle part of that new money back to the politicians who made them that way, so that those politicians and judges will keep them that way. We're seeing this on the Supreme Court. You're seeing this writ large in the Senate. You see it across the Republican Party, and even a few Democrats in the House of Representatives. And by the way, this analysis that I just laid out to you, this is not some radical position from a left-wing talk show host. This is an analysis. Well, first of all, President Jimmy Carter explained this to me on the radio on this show 7 years ago, when he said that here I've got the quote from him. Let me find it for you. He said it violates the essence. We were talking about Citizens United. He says it violates the essence of what made America a great country in its political system. Now it's just an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery being the essence of getting the nominations for president or to elect the president. So now we've seen a complete subversion of our political system as a payoff to major contributors who want and expect and sometimes get favors for themselves after the election's over. So that was Jimmy Carter. But, we can go way, way back before Jimmy Carter. And this is something that was warned we were warned about by, James Madison is probably the most famous Federalist number 10. I'll get to that in a second. Well, in fact, in Federalist number 10, what Madison, I defined the term. He said, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse, a word we don't hear much these days, but it means opposed, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So that was in 1787 that was published. In number 10, the Federalist number 10, that Madison came out and said that. And he said that to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction. He was talking about why they wrote the Constitution. And at the same time, to preserve the spirit in the form of popular government is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. But it really started, it was published, this was published by Lord Bolingbroke the year that James Madison was born. Lord Bolingbroke died in 1751. Madison was born in 1752, and that was the year that Bolingbroke's book was published. And he just laid it out. He said a party, as I take it, is a set of men connected together with the same opinion with respect to public concerns. But when it proceeds further and influences men's conduct in any considerable degree, it becomes faction. So what are the factions? Well, Bolingbroke, again, this is 1751, a British philosopher. He says, and politician. He says, in all such cases, there are reasons and motive. By revealed reasons, I mean a set of plausible doctrines which may be called the creed of the party. But the reserved motive belongs to faction only, and it is the thirst of power. This was the warning in 1751. Beware of the thirst of power. Bolingbroke wasn't the only one. As I mentioned, James Madison wrote about it in Federalist 10. Even David Hume, who was a conservative historian. He wrote The History of England, one of the most famous books in all of history. Or all of Western history, certainly all of British history. But in an essay that he wrote in 1741 titled Of Parties in General, again, before the founders were born, he wrote, as much as legislators and founders of states ought to be honored and respected among men, as much ought the founders of sects and factions to be detested and hated, because the influence of faction is directly contrary to that of laws. Now, what did he mean by contrary to that of laws? Here's what he said in the next paragraph. This is David Hume, 1741. Factions subvert government, render laws impotent, and beget the fiercest animosities among men of the same nation who ought to give mutual assistance and protection to each other. So here we are. We have factions, in other words, wealthy, right-wing billionaires and giant corporations that have taken over the Republican Party and now are openly funding Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Openly. Politico did a great story on this. There's a link to it in my article today over at HartmannReport.com. Openly funding these guys, bragging about it, proud of it. And apparently Manchin and Sinema are proud of the fact that they now have billionaires pouring money into their campaign coffers. And here we go, right? We're off to the races. How rapidly can America decline? We have reached the point now where legislation... 40 years ago, before Reagan, A, there were no billionaires, and B, Congress was routinely passing legislation that everybody loved. Look at the look at Medicare, 1965. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. All of this legislation was passed because the majority of people want it. Now, today, you've got legislation that the majority of people desperately want Congress to pass. The majority of people in America very much want, for example, free education, free college education or trade schools, low-cost health care or free health care, as it were, among other things. But they're not happening, and they're not happening because of faction.